This is the Horse Radio Network.
Greetings, everyone. Coach Jen here, and thanks for tuning in to Horse Tip Daily, episode 1446. Today, we have a conversation with Dr. Brooks about anhidrosis, the inability or reduced ability to sweat. And we're going to get right to this conversation after we hear from our sponsor, Wintec Saddles. Looking for a saddle that's affordable, durable, and comfortable for you and your horse? It sounds like you're looking for a Wintec. Wintec saddles combine world-leading innovations and high-tech materials in a lightweight, weatherproof, and easy-to-care-for saddle. The comprehensive Wintec range offers not only cutting-edge designs, but also reaches new standards in fit, comfort, and performance benefits for both you and your horse. It's easy to see why Wintec is the world's #1 synthetic saddle brand. With styles for any discipline and conformation, there's a Wintec saddle for you. Visit wintec-saddles.com today to view Wintec's full range of saddles and reach a new level of comfort for you and your horse. I'm so happy to welcome back to the show Dr. Samantha Brooks, Associate Professor of Equine Physiology at the University of Florida. Thanks for stopping by, Dr. Brooks.
Oh, great. Thanks for having me. And we always have interesting conversations when you guys call. So
we love having you on because you make really serious science understandable.
Well, thank you. I try.
Well, if we understand it, we're a lot more likely to take those amazing research projects that you guys do and use that information to help our horses. We're going to ask our veterinarians because we go, I understand that a little bit. I need to ask my vet.
Absolutely. And that's key because, this is why we do science. Myself and most people in my lab, we're all horse people. And we want to do things that can help our horses and their horse owners. And if the word doesn't get out, it doesn't get used. So thank you for helping us get the word out.
That's true. There you go. Well, very recently, you guys finished up some research into anhidrosis, which is a very confusing syndrome disease that horses have because in the past, we really haven't known a lot about it, and treatment regimens are limited at best. So let's start this conversation with a really brief Reader's Digest of what is anhidrosis?
Sure. So anhidrosis is loss of the ability to sweat. And among horse people, we sometimes call it a dry coat or a non-sweater. Horses are unique in that they use that full body surface sweat as one of their primary ways to regulate their body temperature. Humans are one of the only other mammalian species that rely this much on sweat. I don't know. Maybe this is why we get along so well with horses. We're generally the both of us sweating when we do things. But it's really kind of an interesting physiological mechanism because it's pretty costly. The moisture and good quality drinking water, that's hard to come by in many environments. So given that it's very specialized and very important, when something goes wrong with it, things go really wrong. So some horses will lose the ability to sweat in their training in response to an increase in the difficulty of the training regimen that they're working through, or sometimes in response to a sudden heat wave. And those episodes of anhidrosis, we usually have a good explanation for. You can have training fatigue or an electrolyte imbalance. The same thing happens to people, especially runners. And we can figure that out and correct it either with rest or supplemental electrolytes, things like that. But some horses will develop anhidrosis that is prolonged and does not respond to any of the obvious changes. So things like electrolytes or vets sometimes look at their hormones to check for an endocrine problem. In those animals, we haven't had any good explanation for what was causing them to lose the ability to sweat. And it's a big deal for horses. So unlike humans, most of them can't move into the air conditioning when they get too hot. So even in northern climates, when you get those hot summer days, it may only last a few days up north, but for those few days, it's easy to get critically overheated. And if you're a performance horse, the inability to cool yourself is immediately a deal breaker. Horses are big, muscular animals, and when those muscles are working, they generate lots of heat. And if they can't dissipate that heat, it becomes life-threatening very quickly. In the mild forms, what horse owners often see are things like their horse might be panting, and sometimes they think that's actually asthma-like signs, because it's breathing, right? So you don't always connect breathing to their skin.
Anyway, yeah. Well, why is my horse panting? Why doesn't he just sweat? He's panting. Oh my gosh, there's something wrong. Well, yeah, and especially like if you're familiar with dogs, panting is a sign of stress if they have their mouth closed and they're breathing hard. So yeah, I can understand that.
For sure, but horses don't stick their tongue out, right, when they pant.
I hope not.
It really just looks like they're breathing hard, yeah? They get lazy, like they don't want to work because they get hot and they feel that heat exhaustion more quickly. So you get performance drop off. Brood mares might start to struggle reproductively. So you get this diverse set of signs that they're just kind of off. And if you aren't carefully examining their skin in the early stages, they will still sweat a little, and so you'll still might have a little bit of a wet saddle pad or wet under the girth, but you may not have put two and two together until they absolutely stop sweating. And if that happens, particularly in the South U.S., where we have a lot of heat and a lot of humidity, it can quickly become a life-threatening situation.
So do we know how long this syndrome has been around? Is it one of those things that, it's been around, but we've only started to really recognize it recently?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are some historical accounts going back to the early half of the 1900s, where they certainly noted that this happened in horses, but they didn't have a solution for it. And they didn't at that time really notice any trends. So it's really been around quite a while. I think more recently we've become more aware of it, just as we're working through optimizing our exercise, physiology for our horses. And I think that we're starting to get the word out more frequently.
Mm-hmm.
The real key study was work done by our colleagues over here at the vet school, led by Dr. Mackay. They examined the pedigrees and the breeds of horses who had anhidrosis. Because up to that point, some people thought it might run in families, but they weren't sure. What they discovered is that a family history gave you about 20 times the risk of getting the disease. So that was right away a big red flag that this might have a genetic component.
Interesting.
Sounds like bad news. Sounds like really bad news, but sometimes it's actually good news because we have these great genetic mapping tools so that if we know absolutely nothing about a disease, it might be okay, because once the genome shows us which gene is involved, that tells us what kind of body process is being interrupted. And then once we know which process to target, we can start to design additional experiments to figure out how to treat or prevent the disease.
So some curious folks started to sit down and look very, very carefully at horses who had been diagnosed and their pedigrees, which led them to say, there might be a family propensity to get this problem. And that's when you jumped up and said, hey, we can do some research. So how did you go about setting up how you were going to research this?
Well, it's a bit of a challenge because anhidrosis does look like a lot of other conditions, and it's a little bit different. It's difficult to diagnose with good precision. So there is a specialized test where we inject a tiny amount of a compound that's a little bit like adrenaline. It's actually terbutaline. But when you inject a tiny droplet of that under the skin, all the little sweat glands above that droplet just start sweating to beat band, right? So on a normal horse, you can inject these tiny droplets and you can actually measure how much sweat is secreted from that little spot on the horse. Doesn't really bother the horse much other than the tiny injections. They're kind of like little fly bites. On an anhidrotic horse, you can see right away. Even if you put that drug right there in a concentrated droplet, those sweat glands cannot manage to do a thing. Even though we have this nifty test, most field veterinarians don't use it very often. They tend to diagnose it more based on exclusion. So they'll rule out things like asthma or electrolyte imbalance or hormonal problems. And then they'll say, well, he must have anhidrosis, and there's nothing we can do about that. So the first challenge of the study was that we needed to define what the disease was. And as much as we would love to have every horse get that very specific skin test for SLEP, we ended up constructing a survey. We had about 300 horse owners mostly from the southern U.S., but we had answers from around the world because this disease is sort of unappreciated in many, many corners of the globe. And they sent in histories. My horse is able to work in the morning, but not in the afternoon, or is completely uncomfortable by May through June. And we gathered all this historical information to create a scale of anhidrosis severity. And then we compared the severity of that disease to a panel of about 500,000 genetic markers across the genome. And using some fancy statistics, we just looked for the markers that were most commonly found in the horses with this severe disease. And using our handy genetic map, we find where that marker is and look for the genes in the neighborhood and start studying what kind of biology those genes contribute to. Sounds really easy that way, doesn't it?
It does sound easy, but it sounds to me like there were some really big brains and even bigger computers involved.
Yes, there are definitely computers involved. And this is something, I love genetics. It's a lot of fun, and I love horses. But had you told me that in order to combine those two things, I would have to learn a fair bit of computer programming and a lot of math and statistics, I probably would have balked. I would be like, no. But these are great tools, and that's the challenge. Is when we go from genetics to genomics and working on the whole genome scale, you have to shift to computers. So those of you out there who are thinking about going into a career in genetics, make sure you work on your computer programming and your math skills. Good news is if you have those skills, it's easy to get a job.
To make your job a lot easier. So once you did all this and you concluded at the end of it that there is a genetic component, is there going to be, or should there be, or does there need to be further research that will tell you it definitely does or definitely doesn't? Or are the conclusions of this study saying that we know for a fact that there's a component, but it's only a component? Did I phrase that question well? I don't think so. Yeah, no, I think you've got it right. So this is just one study, and science is always an ongoing process. And we definitely would love to do some continuing work. The struggle we have right now is, while this is an important condition for the horse industry struggles to get themselves organized and to fund science. So we actually ran out of funding. But there you go.
They're definitely, sadly, it's very, very important, but it's not quite as high profile as things like colic. So,
right.
Although there's probably, it is not an infrequent condition. It's just not frequently present.
I'm surprised how common it is. Yeah. Living in Florida, any horse that's afflicted with this, even to a minor degree, you hear about, because, you live in the South and it's hot and humid so much of the year, it can be really detrimental to their health. So for somebody who has a horse that they suspect could be anhidrotic, what is the best way to have your veterinarian diagnose that problem?
Well, I think the gold standard is still going to be the skin test, because there are easier treatment options for horses who have a more run-of-the-mill case of anhidrosis. Where things get more challenging is when they do have what we call the idiopathic type. And a large proportion of those horses, based on our study, will have these genetic markers. And genetic markers are pretty inexpensive. So if you've gone through a lot of exclusionary diagnostics and you haven't found an answer, it's not a bad idea at all to run the genetic test, even though we're still in the preliminary stages of getting these results out and field tested, right?
Mm-hmm.
And certainly, if you're thinking about a pre-purchase exam or breeding horses, comprehensive genetic testing is a good idea anyway. But you bet, being here in Florida, before I buy a horse, I'm gonna double check.
Check that,
just in case.
Just in case.
It's not going to be 100%. But anhidrosis is so frustrating because we have absolutely no scientifically proven treatments, not beer, not nutritional supplements.
That was my next question is, you have a horse who has anhidrosis. What now?
Well, for those of you who have a horse with anhidrosis right now, the best thing you can do for that horse is provide supplemental cooling. So a lot of our horse owners will shift to actually bring them into the barn during the day. And if they're still going to ride, they'll ride at night when the temperatures are cooler. They might wet that horse externally, so he can't sweat to wet himself, but you can certainly do frequent cold hosing, install barn misters, or there are some specialized absorbent kind of blanket materials that will release that moisture slowly that can help. And then you want to evaporate that moisture once you put it on the horse. So stall fans are fantastic. Get that air moving. What we're hope will happen in the future, though, if we can pick this research back up with some renewed funding, is that the gene that contributes to idiopathic anhidrosis in the horse is a channel that moves ions. So ions are things like salt and chloride, right? Our electrolytes. It moves those ions across the cell membrane. And actually, there's a number of diseases in people that impact the same type of cellular machinery, those ion channels that move those electrolytes across membranes. One of the most famous of those is cystic fibrosis.
Did not know that.
The benefit there is, right. So there's some functional similarity. And people with cystic fibrosis often have problems, not only with their lungs and their mucous membranes and digestion, but also their sweat. So now you can kind of see, here we go. Now we've got the connection. Now, the great thing about that similarity is that we have put millions of dollars into studying cystic fibrosis because it impacts a lot of people. And that includes developing a number of drug compounds to help to fix those difficulties with your ion channels. So the hopeful, long-term, pie-in-the-sky, hopeful message here is that if we can chase down this ion channel hypothesis, there might be pharmaceutical drugs already developed that could potentially help to maybe prevent development of the condition in the horse or alleviate some of the symptoms of the disease before the sweat glands become too damaged to be able to function.
Cool. So, oh, wow, I could just talk about this forever, but we're kind of running out of time. So if for folks who want to read up on all of the fascinating studies that you have done and other things going on at the University of Florida, where can they appropriately stalk you guys online?
Well, our website, we are finally starting to get it caught up during quarantine. I have to say that we were definitely in triage mode, and website, ironically, was not top of the list while we were all trying to learn to Zoom, right? But our website is Equine Genetics, all one word, .org. And we do have a recent extension publication actually talking about anhidrosis. So through our UF ISIS extension service, you can get that short PDF. I'll work on getting our links up to date. So we have a link available there on the website. And we've got a couple short video clips that are going to be coming out pretty soon along with our collaborators over at the vet school. So
cool.
There's quite a bit there. If you start Googling UF Anhidrosis genetics, you can find us pretty quickly.
Cool. And I've been watching some of your videos. They're really good. Again, because you make super duper science understandable. So thank you very much. The Horse Radio Network and the Horse Radio Network hosts are not responsible for statements made by guests on the Horse Tip Daily. Please use your own judgment when listening to the tips on this show.